Hi, it's been a while since I've been able to make a video like this, and I decided to kick back my return to all this with a weird little topic called, hi darling, why are you in a goose mask and where did you get that? Yeah, I guess it is out, and, I guess I gotta put my other stuff on hold, like the lost media and bootleg Pokemon translations. My word's my word, after all. Okay. You know what? Fine. I'm happy to involve you with my work, and the whole length of this little thing will actually take us past YouTube's no swearing point, so let's just get into what this video is actually about. Sonic the fucking Hedgehog. Never before has there been a video topic that I've dreaded talking about so much. And yes, I do actually owe my fiancé this video. Initially, I was going to use this video to explain how I would come to even owe my dork a video like this, but I think it would be more appropriate to note that Sonic the Hedgehog as a series, despite what a laughingstock it's become in recent years, is pretty damn important to my formative years. You see, the first console I received was a hand-me-down Model 2 Genesis. I need to make that a little bit more accurate to the one I got as a kid. Oh yeah, that's the one. 6-pack, crustiness to the box, crustiness to the image, it's perfect. But it's why I like the Sega Genesis so much, as well as why I have such a soft spot for Sonic. So it's not just that I owe my fiancé a video. But with me making this video to give my honest thoughts on a franchise that, like it or not in my case, is important to me, I do want to lay out what exactly I'm doing. First off, I'm going to be presenting these games in the best possible ways to play them. Decompilations, bug fixes, and restorations are the only modifications permitted, along with a special one that we'll get to whenever we get to Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Second of all, it's going to be a mix between what I can actually run and what I deem important with this. For example, Sonic Unleashed is only really that solid if you're running it through the new backwards compatibility. Running it off of emulation, or in my case, off of PS3 hardware, is a mangled pile of jank. But also avoiding unimportant spin-offs, except as like maybe aside notes. With this information all out of the way though, let's start the game where it all began. Sonic 1, a game that despite having the 6-pack cartridge for my Genesis, I actually didn't play for the longest time. I have no nostalgia for it, so I can tell you that it kind of sucks. It's a bad game with 2 good levels. See, when people think of the Genesis Sonic games, they think of fast, momentum-built gameplay. That really only applies to 2 zones, the overused in modern times Green Hill Zone and Starlight Zone. The rest of the game, even with Taxman's version adding the spin dash from Sonic 2 and onward, is just a slog. Marble, Labyrinth, and the on-screen Scrap Brain Zone are just miserable experiences to go through in gaming. All of the fun, momentum-based speed goes completely out the window in exchange for some of the, most tedious and slow platforming I've seen in a supposed speedy killer app. And as a segue into the next game, I once had someone close to me ask if, possibly, Sonic 1 could be considered the only true-to-form game in the series, and, well, I get to say no because it's time for... That's right, it's time for Sonic CD, one of the games in the series that I've actually grown to like more over the years. You see, Sonic CD takes all of the methodical platforming of Sonic 1 and not only retools it, but cuts it down significantly. You see, you can time travel between 3 time periods, past, present, and future. The most important of those 3 is past. best, as it allows you to go and hunt for a specific capsule that contains the flowers that are in Badniks in this game. It's honestly pretty neat in its execution, especially since it's not mandatory. Sorta. It is not the only way you can take to the game's good ending. That would be something that I left out of the Sonic 1 portion. If you collect 50 rings and jump into the giant ring that appears at the end of stage signpost, then you can enter a pretty great special stage, to be honest. On its original release on the Sega CD, these stages were quite slow and cumbersome despite being, well, a pretty impressive showcase of the scaling and rotation chip within the Sega CD. But the modern port, as well as the decompilation of it obviously, run pretty smoothly and it makes these really trippy special stages pop, even if I'm not using the trippiest as an example. But it's really cool that the game does give you two methods of reaching the good ending, and if you want to do both at the same time, yeah, go ahead. The game won't stop you. And the cherry on top is just how aesthetically strong this game is. To put it bluntly, Sonic CD is fucking gorgeous. Almost every stage, past, present, and good future, are so vibrant that it just pops, and everything just pops. I do think the later special stages go a little too hard on that, but I mean, it's a bit too much of a good thing. And the music, at the least in the Japanese version, is spectacular. Like, the US soundtrack is fine, but it's a lot more atmospheric, which isn't what I want from a Sonic game. I could spend so much time gushing about the mere aesthetics of Sonic CD alone, and it's kind of a shame a lot of people didn't get to play this until later on. You see, Sonic CD has the unfortunate thing of being a game for an add-on that didn't do the best. Granted, not as terribly as the absolute abomination known as the Sega 32X, but now, especially since the Taxman decomps exist, this is a great game to go through. I mean though, if you really want me to say something negative about this game, let me just say two words. Wacky Workbench. Because it's quite important to the series as a whole, I do think it's important to take some time out of this to talk about the developers of the next two games, Sega Technical Institute. You see, the average person might just think that Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 and Knuckles were just Sonic Team, but that's only partially true. You see, Sega Technical Institute, represented by this little logo right here, was founded by Mark Cerny, a man with an honestly impressive resume, but it was created as a means of shoring up both the American talent and the Japanese talent of Sega. The big game that these two wings were working on together was, of course, our next game, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. And Sonic 2 is important to the tale of Sega Technical Institute, and vice versa. As during the development of this game, the Japanese and American wings of STI began to have some pretty significant tension that leads to a lot of what comes later down the line. But it all started with the development of Sonic 2. With that all out of the way, let's continue to the game proper. Sonic 2 is the first game that people really begin to praise within the series, and with regards to at least the first half of the game, I can't blame them. Emerald Hill is a pretty decent Green Hill clone from before we all got sick of Green Hill. Chemical Plant balances having a groovy tune, being a decent basic stage for pretty early on in a game, and throws in a couple of spectacles for good measure. Like Tidal Tempest back in Sonic CD, Aquatic Ruin is also a pretty decent water stage, especially since it gives you so many opportunities to stay out of the water. And Casino Night is a bright and gaudy bop through a bunch of pinball machines. Now, I'm saying some pretty positive things about Sonic 2 so far, but unfortunately, the quality kind of drops back and forth after Casino Night. The rest of the zones are either inoffensive and boring, or just the source of memes, or both. Even the artwork for the zones doesn't stand out as much, it's just drab. I mean, when the most notable things in a stage's palettes are either baby blue, or in Oil Ocean's case, orange and orange and orange, and just the combination with the lackluster platforming in these stages is ugh. I didn't bother with Sky Chase or Wing Fortress or Death Egg with recording because we have a lot of ground to cover in one video. But did you really think that I forgot about Metropolis Zone? The infamous soul-crushing part of Sonic 2 that, well, really, Metropolis Zone just fucking sucks and...
You!
Nope. I'm actually finally talking about mechanics though, since a lot of what goes on in the 2D games is introduced in Sonic 2. Like that yellow glowy version of Sonic, that's called Super Sonic. Super Sonic can run faster, jump higher, and is overall invincible to everything but drowning. But it's not given to you, it's rewarded to you. And how is it rewarded to you? Well, as with the first two games, you have to gather up 50 rings and jump into not the end signpost this time, but a checkpoint, specifically the stars above it. And Sonic 2 introduces the half-pipe special stage, which, in the Retro Engine version, is actually rendered in 3D instead of choppy, janky fake scaling. It is absolutely fine, if at sometimes hard, especially if you're rusty, and I really hope it doesn't come back in a way that is hair-splittingly difficult and makes me regret life itself. But the last thing I do need to mention is how the act structure changed. It's a part of why people hate Metropolis so much. See, with Sonic 1 and CD, there were 3 acts per zone, even if 3 barely existed in Sonic CD. Metropolis is the only zone in Sonic 2 with 3 acts, and it has some pretty dickish enemy placement and collision. Which is, for the record, why it's so enjoyable absolutely punishing Metropolis Zone with Super Sonic. The act count being cut to 2 per zone is actually probably one of the things I think Sonic 2 did the best. It keeps you moving through the zones at a pretty decent pace so that they have less of a chance of going stale. But stuff like this is also why I'm willing to say that, despite a pretty underwhelming and sometimes infuriating latter half, that Sonic 2 did a lot right. But there is one more game that both wings of STI worked on, and that would be... Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Can't forget about the Knuckles. Can't forget about the memes, kids. I'm running this one through Sonic 3 Air or Angel Island Revisited. It uses a ROM of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which is what's dumped onto a cartridge board that actually used to be legally available through Steam, which is how I did it, but that would be opening up the Sonic Origins can of worms, and nope. Like the Retro Engine versions of Sonic 1, 2, and CD, this adds a lot of bells and whistles, and I mean a lot more than the Retro Engine versions, some of which you'll see enabled in my gameplay. It also allows for mods, which I've used to swap out Sonic sprites with his Sonic 2 sprites, cause I've got a proofreader who would grouse to me endlessly about Sonic sprites if I didn't. And I honestly don't have as much to say about Sonic 3 and Knuckles than I do about Sonic 2. It just sets out to further refine what was already established in Sonic 2, and for the most part, it succeeds. Even the Blue Sphere stages, with its fake scaling, was a lot cleaner and more interesting than the half-pipe was, at the least on Sega hardware at the time. And before I talk more about the game itself, it's kind of a miracle that it just turned out as well as it did. Because development for Sonic 3, or rather, what was supposed to be the complete version of Sonic 3, but ended up Sonic 3 and Knuckles, was an absolute mess. After all, we're talking about a game that got split in half, as it's now widely well known, thanks to a deal with McDonald's for toys. There was even a lot of contention over the music rights because of the fact that it was rumored for a long time that Michael Jackson had composed some of the tracks for it, which was only partially true. A man named Brad Buxer, and I am very sorry if I butcher that name, was the one who did most of the Michael Jackson credited tracks, but because he was working with MJ, the estate owns most of that music. The history of Sonic 3 and Knuckles is probably the most fascinating thing about it, and I would actually recommend, once you're done watching this video, going to look it up. I'd go over more of it, but we have a lot more games to cover. But it would also be a disservice to this game to move on without, saying what it does and improves on over Sonic 2. The most obvious one is that Sonic 3 and Knuckles really drastically improves the spectacle aspect of the Sonic series. The bits of automation and gameplay that are meant to just stop you in your tracks and make you say, wow! Heck, you get to pretty early on in Angel Island, where at first you're running away from an airship that's trying to bomb you, and you're just outrunning all the explosions. It's easy, yeah, but the spectacle is obviously the more important thing. And after that boss fight, the bridge you're standing on gets destroyed by Knuckles, thus sending you to Hydro City. Alright, before I wind up getting people on my ass, I should probably get the official katakana and just...
Hydro City. Hydro City. Hydro City.
It has been decades upon decades, and I can absolutely assure you that this is something still debated by Sonic fans. The pronunciation of if it's Hydro City or Hydrocity. But I'm just going to keep this section in to give my reasoning and say that fuck you, I'm right. But to get back on track, sometimes the spectacle can be entire boss fights. Doomsday Zone would be a little too easy, so instead I'm going for Marble Gardens boss fight, where you have Tails and infinite flight no matter if you choose to play as any character alone, and just who knows how high up you are. For something simpler and easier while also still being effective, there's also the snowboarding scene at the beginning of Ice Cap Zone Act 1. It's automated and it does look kind of weird with the Sonic 2 sprites, but it's about the spectacle, it's about the wow factor. I'd say the entirety of Sky Sanctuary also counts, especially with how it opens. But otherwise, there's not as much to say about the game itself because it's a lot of more of the same, but just better, a lot more polished. A lot of people call this the best of what is called the Genesis era, and I can get it. It's the most coherent and cohesive of the 4 games. Is it perfect? Fuck no. Sandopolis Zone Act 2 is just so monotonous and so boring. But as we go on into the Sonicless Saturn years, currently, this is the gold standard, Sonic 3 and Knuckles. It's not the best game in the world, but it doesn't have to be. It's cohesive and coherent, and it does have fun qualities to it. Despite its faults, it succeeds at being a great game, and I want you all to keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward. And here we are. Nothingness. It's not like Sonic games didn't come out during the Saturn era, but most of them were spin-offs and pretty awful. And I don't think many people would consider an enhanced port of the technically impressive but gameplay-wise abysmal Sonic 3D Blast, or the first remakes in Sonic Jam as new Sonic games. In the aftermath, Yuji Naka, remember this guy for later, did absolutely everything possible to insulate Sonic Team from the corporate bickering. They got to work on what was supposed to be the Saturn Sonic game after that. But, because internationally the Saturn flopped, and that's not to say it didn't do well, it did pretty good in Japan for a good while. But Sega was outright hemorrhaging money, especially with studios like Studio Andromeda, an internal team that made all the Panzer Dragoon games, which, let's not open that rabbit hole either. As well as the sheer amount of money that they were giving to arcade darling Yu Suzuki to develop Shenmue, all of the killer apps that they were trying to develop were moved to one final, foolish push into the hardware market, the Sega Dreamcast. The Sonic Team end of that became Sonic Adventure. So Sonic Adventure 1 is a little bit of a strange case. See, every single version after the Dreamcast just kept getting worse and worse. There are a massive list of downgrades even between versions of SADX, let alone the Dreamcast version, so for the sake of keeping things moving, I'll just link to Cybershell's video in the description about just that SADX is a bad port. However, I am using the Steam version of Sonic Adventure Director's Cut as better SADX exists. It basically gives you the best of both the Dreamcast and the GameCube versions, including the little Game Gear bonuses that were included. It provides you with a sort of Dreamcast version plus experience that has the GameCube functions in, as well as running at 60 frames with the issues addressed with running it at 60 instead of 30, as well as running in widescreen. With that all out of the way, but you know what? After being told so many times that Sonic Adventure 1 hasn't aged well, or that I've had the Sonic's rough transition to 3D meme dropped on me, I'm happy to say I had a really good time with Sonic Adventure 1. It is such a pile of jank with its strange, weird animations and its poor lip sync. But there's such an ambition that shines through that it harkens back to my times playing Deus Ex. Especially in later areas, you can tell they really gave it their all in making this game pop. There's so many admirable lighting and fog effects that they just used to give this game some absolutely stellar atmosphere. And the soundtrack is so good. Second favorite soundtrack in the entire series, and with tunes like this, can you really blame me? And I can't keep up the positivity anymore. I'm so far only talking about Sonic's campaign. You see, Sonic's campaign controls tightly, is mostly stress-free, and plays pretty fun. It also does its job of showcasing exactly what the Dreamcast could do so early on, and it's pretty good despite its janky faults. It also weds the spectacle and the substance pretty damn well for a first shot at 3D Sonic. To showcase what I mean, I'm using Speed Highway, the stage you've been looking at, as my example. It's one of the more well-known of Sonic Adventure 1's stages. From the very get-go, you're already looking at an exaggerated version of something that we actually have in real life, a highway. There's many parts of the level that you can actually use as a bit of a parkour playground as well, giving you a bit more freedom over everything and how you approach the situation. And once you get to a specific point, it gives you the level's climax. For Speed Highway, it's barreling straight down the skyscraper through a bunch of pillars, helicopters, and so forth. It's the part of the stage that comes right before either the end or a little bit of an easy cooldown section. It's meant to be almost purely spectacle with very little substance, and you know, it's a showpiece. But a lot of the stage design in Sonic Adventure 1 tries to follow this philosophy, and if they can't entirely do it, then they give you a lot more substance. So of course, all of this design philosophy goes straight out the window with every other character in the game. The only game mode that I actually think complements Sonic's at all is Amy's. Because see, even if they're going about it in different ways, Sonic and Amy's stages are all about platforming. Amy's stages are more methodical and sometimes focus more on verticality, but they oftentimes offer you a different perspective on a stage. The inoffensive but not exactly great ones would be Gamma's shooting gallery-esque third-person shooter stages, as well as Knuckles' treasure hunting stages. While the treasure hunting stages are the better of these two game modes, they're both far too meatless. Luckily, I'm sure they're just in this game, and I won't be playing an even worse version of these two in the future. If you want fine, but absolutely out of place though, look no further than Large the Feline, Big the Cat's, fishing stages. These stages are kind of infamous by now, and I think it's because they're required to fully beat the game. It's more something you expect out of a minigame than something absolutely mandatory. And the horrible rubber band AI heavy... Tails. Let me just show you why Tails' gameplay is just terrible in this. Wow, I barely got to use any of Slider. That's sad. And I'm not even getting into the sheer amount of boss refights per character there are. Like, you'll fight Chaos 4 3 separate times. Once as Sonic, once as Tails, and once as Knuckles. It's quite a slog, but weirdly enough, none of these actually bad issues really affected how much I enjoyed large chunks of this game. When it's good, it's damned good. And a lot of what they were trying to do really shines through. But there's one other game bearing the Adventure moniker. So I guess we have to get into Sonic Adventure 2. I'm not even gonna try to beat around the bush even though I'm using the energetic rock music. Sonic Adventure 2 is one step forward, 2 steps back. And this is the one I'd actually have the most nostalgia for. Like, this is one of the ones I got with a hand-me-down GameCube back in the day. At least when it comes to 3D games. But every improvement comes with at least one downside. I do want to keep my time with Sonic Adventure 2 brief because of the fact that I thoroughly did not enjoy my time with this game. It's not even that it's a dreadful game, it's just a step in the wrong direction. So I'll give the improvement, and then I'll give the caveat. The graphical fidelity is vastly improved over Sonic Adventure 1, but a lot of the presentation hasn't evolved with them, especially in cutscenes. In fact, if I wanted to be snarky, I could say that the cutscenes make the characters look like Muppets that not even Jim Henson would love. Just look at how stretchy these guys are, ugh. The next example I have is that the speed stages are polished to a razor sheen. Yeah, you could argue that they lean a little too hard into the spectacle over the substance, but Sonic's never felt better in a 3D space. Also, of course, City Escape is the best opening ever. The caveat to this one is that they brought back the shooting stages and the treasure hunt stages worse than ever. They're both shit. With the shooting stages, that's the easiest to describe everything that's wrong with them. They're slow, boring slogs. And unfortunately, it doesn't matter how much atmosphere you add to something, if the gameplay is bad, it's just going to be thoroughly unpleasant. And I do have to give this game that it still does have an amazing atmosphere, although I would say a little bit less than Sonic Adventure 1 despite the graphical fidelity increase. The only shooting stage to actually buck the trend and be actually enjoyable though is Cosmic Wall. It's still linear, but it gives you a lot of movement freedom with the fact that you can now use your little hover tank to just jet up into the air. They explain it in-game as there being low gravity, but I would have loved more of this sort of movement since it's fun. But the problem with the treasure hunting stages this time around though is that, okay, so see, the treasure hunting stages in SA1 were inoffensive because they were pretty small and pretty contained. So the problem with Adventure 2's though is that they're just too big. See, I can expect that people would expect me to say that, well, they nerfed the Emerald Radar, so of course it's worse. Once you're past the first stage, these levels are so big that the radar is practically worthless anyways. you are genuinely better off using the hint system. With the last two treasure hunting stages, Meteor Herd and Mad Space being exceptionally awful and just soul draining. Especially Mad Space. Fuck Mad Space. It's a giant stage with a bunch of planets that have their own gravity, and every hint system lies to you. I fear the day I meet someone who unironically enjoys Mad Space, because that's the sort of person you gotta look out for. But before we get back to the caveats, there are some things that this game introduced to the series. Edgy Hot Topic teen bait Shadow the Hedgehog, and furry bait Rouge the Bat. Alright, let me do the last caveat. They vastly and greatly improved one of the mini-games that people seem to like for some reason from the last game. But for some bonkers reason, giving me flashbacks to Big's fucking fishing, they tied the Chow Garden to full completion. Like, the Chow Garden was their thing to get VMU integration going, and once the GameCube ports came along, that was for the interconnectivity with the advanced games, but I hate the Chow Garden with a burning passion. My friends will tell me I am wrong, and I will tell them that if I wanted a Tamagotchi experience, I would go play one of the Digimon World games. So in Sonic Adventure 2, they introduced emblems, and some of them are obtained explicitly through the Chow Garden. At least, full completion gets you a better reward than, say, Super Mario Sunshine's postcard, but it still seems a bit weird that, they put the keys to unlock it behind a minigame that is so weirdly and vastly different, again. At the least, the music is still good, and I still wouldn't call Sonic Adventure 2 bad. I would just call it disappointing and at times infuriating. But after the Dreamcast failed and Sega were just barely saved by, well, I kid you not, one of their key investors who they didn't listen to, leaving them all of his money, specifically so that they could pivot purely into software development. The next game is the first pure multi-platform game that the series had ever had. The first truly multi-platform Sonic game, Sonic Heroes. As a result, your experience is going to depend on which version you grab. The PS2 and PC versions are virtually unplayable, so I'm just going to emulate an old dump of the GameCube version so I can run it in widescreen. The benefits of running it in emulation instead of getting my old GameCube disc out is that, well, the aforementioned widescreen. The only downside is that the skyboxes will look crusty, but that's because they were never intended for such things. I genuinely want to like Sonic Heroes more than I do. Here's the thing, Sonic Heroes is super duper aesthetically strong. It decides to bake the spectacle into the environment by just having every single stage be so over the top. To put it into perspective, the most normal looking level is this large ancient ocean temple right by the seaside, and that's the first stage. It is so absolutely bombastic, but it's kind of let down by two absolutely horrendous major flaws. For the most part, Sonic Heroes controls absolutely abysmally. Flight characters and power characters tend to have the least offensive controls out of the three, and with a couple of the power characters, they'll just rocket forward every time you decide to use a melee attack. But what's more important are the speed characters. The way they accelerate from 0 to 1000 in a second is nigh uncontrollable. And even though I can personally get used to the controls because I've played a lot worse, like, let's face it, I'm someone who plays bootlegs for fun. It's this sort of thing that prevents me from calling Sonic Heroes good. Oh, right, and one other thing that keeps me from calling it good. The game's structure is dreadful because it requires 4+ playthroughs. and it's just replaying the same game at various difficulties, or in Team Chaotix's case, doing weirdly disorganized tasks. And if that's not bad enough, yes, the game ties the true ending to this. You have to clear all 4 campaigns and collect the Chaos Emeralds. How do you collect the Chaos Emeralds? Well, you have to take a key to the end of the stage with bad controls and then go through another instance of bad controls. That would be the special stage, or as I would like to call it, the Tube of Pain. Even from just this footage, you all could probably tell how hard it is just to keep characters running in a straight line. It is such a blight that it perfectly and accurately just puts all of Sonic Heroes' problems on display. The abysmal controls, the fact that you're going to be hitting up the same damn thing over and over and over again because of both those damn controls and just how the game is. But at the end of the day, thanks to its fatal flaws, Sonic Heroes is just brought down to mediocrity. And that's a shame because, in all other aspects, it's really strong. But it's one of the strongest examples of how, no matter how much you polish up your presentation, if the gameplay fails, then it's going to be an unpleasant experience. Between the control issues and the structural problems, yeah. What I've been showing you is the game at its most fun, going through one time as Team Sonic. But the sheer length of it all makes everything that fails about the game far more prominent. It's something that you would really hope is fixed in the next game. And before we move on, for the record, I wasn't even going to include the next game as a part of this video, but there were things happening within Sega during its production that makes me kind of have to cover it. So let's get on to the memes with... let's get it out of the way.
Where's that damn 4th Chaos Emerald?
Shadow the Hedgehog is the first mainline Sonic game that is truly abysmal. And I know what some of you are thinking, dear viewers. Game bad 'cause edgy. Hell no! The game's only tolerable because of the edgy stuff. The edgy stuff is pure comedy. In fact, we even know what game led to the decision to make this game, big air quotes here, darker. And that would be the Sony and Naughty Dog game, Jak 2. One of the key members of which was... Mark Cerny. Programmer and designer, huh? Damn. I guess Sega Technical Institute got its revenge inadvertently beyond the grave. And before I get negative, I do want to point out the singular positive of this game. During what I'll call the first modern era, Sega were constantly trying to up their game on the presentation. While their sound mixing was pretty consistently abysmal, they always tried to achieve more fidelity, and I actually think the CG cutscenes are where it shines through the most. We go from stuff like this cutscene in Sonic Adventure 2, where I can only hear...
I'm pissing on the moon!
Along with its strange early CG humans that kinda look like plastic dolls. Now, compare that to the first thing that you see in Shadow the Hedgehog. Sure, he's rocking a delightful pump-action SMG, but it's a lot better in production quality alone. It's clean and smooth and miles away from that uncanny look that Sonic Adventure 2 had. But, you know, as I said, the game itself is dreadful, and I can easily get into why. Think Sonic Heroes, but everything's worse. Controls are even more slippery somehow, and as represented by these boss circles, each of which can only be encountered on their own playthrough, you have to play the game at least 10 times. And the missions are oftentimes scatterbrained, if not just shoot everything, and it's a good thing that the auto-aim in Shadow the Hedgehog is probably the most generous you'll ever get in a video game ever. But none of these are the reasons that I decided to bring up this game. Remember that being insulated from the rest of Sega that I mentioned? Well, Shadow the Hedgehog is the last game that Sonic Team made under conditions like that. At this time, Sega was looking for a merger, and the one they eventually went with was Sammy Corporation, creating Sega Sammy Holdings. Of course, that also meant that things had to be reined in a lot. As is nowadays common knowledge, Sega was run quite messily. Of course, this wasn't the end of Sonic's trouble as, well, they attempted a reboot, and I think everyone knows how it went. Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. The biggest dead horse in the franchise. I know it sucks. You know it sucks. Even if you've never touched a video game, there's a chance you may have heard of Sonic 06. So of course, the point of bringing up Sonic 06 is less the game itself, and more what was happening during the production of it. Things were already a little bit iffy because of the fact that Sonic Team was divided into working on 2 projects. This one, and the abysmal Sonic and the Secret Rings. So of course, Yuji Naka wound up leaving Sega and poaching a large chunk of Sonic Team. Damn, I wonder what he's been up to recently. Alright then, let me update that little title I put for him. And if you're expecting me to dump on any of the games that he was involved with at this time, then prepare to stay disappointed. Regardless of how much this man has sullied his reputation, there were countless amounts of other people who worked hard on those projects, even if they turned out half-baked. But needless to say, this absolutely had an impact on Sega, and especially Sonic, like, a large chunk of employees on 2 titles, one of which is supposed to be this next-gen showcase, are suddenly missing. Regardless of hindsight, Sonic 06 and Sonic and the Secret Rings are pretty widely trashed as terrible games that just happen to have good music. Sonic games normally have good music. There's still a lot of he said, she said, especially with how Sega used to be run, but there is one more game in what could be called the first modern era to talk about. So Sonic Unleashed alone is the primary reason why this video took even longer than a long video like this normally does. It was such a pain that my woes deserve a little bit of a quick mention. See, I've owned all 3 of the big versions because they were quite cheap, and there was no way in hell that I was going to use the Wii version developed by a company that I shall not name until I cover their worst title. And both the 360 and PS3 versions run quite terrible on original hardware. And as I don't have the modern Xbox yet to use the backwards compatibility, which also allows 60 frames per second, you're instead stuck with painstakingly set up emulation, which runs even more smoothly. Messing with the configuration settings was a bit of a pain, but just how smooth it turned out is quite the testament to how impressive 360 emulation is. With this all out of the way, though. But you might have noticed as the video has gone on that I've been using words like substance and spectacle. Sonic Unleashed decides to carry it in a new direction where the spectacle is the stage itself. Everything is blazing fast and based upon twitch reflexes now, with the reward being able to keep the boost going. Sure, it's not the momentum-based gameplay of old, but it's not terrible in concept. It's still quite fun going back to, as long as you ignore things like the werehog and the metal hunting. Just go grab a save file, don't worry, I won't tell anyone. But with the boost formula, they had something a bit decent. Sure, it needed more polish, but that's what future games are for, right? Well, if you're wondering why Sonic Unleashed segment was so short, here you go. I have a lot to say about Sonic Colors and what it brought to the table. You see, Sonic Colors kind of changed out the game writers. The 2 people that were brought on board were Ken Pontac and Warren Graff. Now, it may seem odd that they brought aboard the people who did Happy Tree Friends. No, you are not getting a reference graphic for that. But it's not like they hadn't worked with Sega before. You see, through Platinum Games, Pontac and Graff had both worked with Sega before on Mad World. A game that I admittedly never played and have always been curious about to see if it's good. And at the time, people liked it because of the fact that the writing wasn't convoluted. But you know what they say, hindsight is 20/20. And the writing just became a lot too cheesy and crossed into cringe territory, as well as just self-aware. And not the good kind. The ha-ha we know we suck kind. As if the writers themselves knew Sonic's stigma and decided to try to laugh along with it, but it's more like a pained chuckle. But these writers are going to be responsible for the next few games, so I figured I'd bring it up on the first game that they worked on, Sonic Colors. Bearing no real ill will towards them, the writing didn't suit the game, so how's the game itself? It's not good. Sonic Colors, for the record, was a game I was excited for. It was the rare pre-order for me, and I even got that nifty little Sonic hat that I still have to this day, and back then I was disappointed with it. It felt so meatless and short, and when I came back to replay it for this, I found myself disliking it even more. A lot of these games I've learned to have a lot more appreciation for over the years. Sonic Colors, on the other hand, is, wait, this is it? This is good? No, it's not. In fact, it shares a lot of similarities with my criticisms and complaints of Sonic Heroes. Aesthetically, Sonic Colors is a gorgeous game. As long as you stick to the original version and not the re-release, I don't know if they fixed it and I don't care, it just looked really bad. Even being stuck on underpowered hardware at that time, like the Wii, really didn't stop it from being eye-catching. And when the music slaps, whoo, does it slap! Unfortunately, that's where all the positives end. See, with the Wii setup having less buttons by default, a lot of the game is trimmed back. Things like the drift and the quick step only become usable in certain sections, and no, the re-release does not remedy it. Plus, those sections are now a lot shorter, and there's been a decent amount of speculation as to why, but that's not why we're here. Plus, there's just a lot of really awkward controlling 2D segments. It's not very good, and it's usually at its best in 2D when you're using a wisp power to skip it. And this time around, wisps are the primary means of making sure there are multiple paths to a very short goal. Yeah, it's impressive that Sonic Colors is so eye-catching on the Wii, but is that really saying much when the game's just a step back in every single way from Unleashed? Luckily, the follow-up, while having some spots that were still pretty meatless, was a lot better. Sonic Generations is probably the best boost formula game you'll play ever. And at the least, the story being so bare bones means that there's nothing to get in the way between you and some boost action. With the intent being an anniversary celebration for the Sonic series as a whole, Sega decided to do something unique. All of the stages, barring the ones in the 3DS version that's by a company that we will not mention till I cover their worst game, was done by a poll. The downside is that a lot of similarly themed stages won. The upside is that the gameplay loop takes the best of Colors and Unleashed and makes it into something that actually works. Aside from Planet Wisp and the entirety of Classic Sonic's gameplay, Classic Sonic's gameplay is just rancid. Slow and stiff, and the only redeeming quality is that the spin dash is hilariously overpowered. But I've played Generations probably the most of any of these games. It is probably the boost formula game that lends itself the best to these quick bursts of play where you try to speedrun stuff. It's made even better by the rise of portable gaming PCs like the Steam Deck. But it's kind of just, they stuck to the boost formula, learned from their blunders with Colors, and just made something good and fun. Yeah, there's still some bad elements in it, but no game's gonna be perfect, and the good parts stand out enough on their own merit to say, yeah, this is fine. and this is just a case of the less I have to say, the better. But this brings us to... And it's finally time for Sonic Mania. One of my proofreaders actually wanted me to be a lot harsher with this game, but I quickly pointed out one thing. This is a budget game, and even when it released, it wasn't that expensive. And considering the absolute night and day in quality between this budget game and the last one that was released, I'm gonna say that especially for what you're paying for it, this game's pretty great. It builds a lot off of the Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 and Knuckles formula, and adds a lot of modern flourish even when it's rehashing stages from older games. I can tolerate nostalgia baiting with Sonic Mania because the rest of the product is so good that I can forgive it. It's a flaw, yeah, but it doesn't degrade the experience so much that it's unenjoyable. The teams this was outsourced to were basically run by old ROM hackers, and they and the composer of T-Lopes did a fantastic job of just making something that feels like the 32-bit Sonic game that we never got. The most I can say is that, yeah, sometimes the game leans a little too much into automation and spectacle, but if the mishaps are few enough and far between enough, then the rest of the game can pretty much show its merits and strut its stuff. And despite the fact that it was confirmed that corporate was responsible for why there's so much rehashing, Sonic Mania as a whole feels like a labor of love, and I really can't knock it. However, because we're dealing with the first of two games that use the plot point of the Phantom Ruby, we have to get into... If I were to make a comparison point with Sonic Forces, I would say it's akin to Duke Nukem Forever, but just less disgusting. It is not the worst game I have played. It is not even the worst game in this video. But even then, it's kind of one of the lowest points in the series. To explain a lot of it, I don't even have to go into the game itself, but something quite rare that we have for a Sonic game. The development timeline and some leaked stuff that was put up while the game was in development. We have the early script and all, complete with commentary from someone from Sega at the time. A lot of the script details are available on the cutting room floor, and I'll be linking to the article in the description. So let's start with the development cycle, because it'll explain a lot. As stated in an interview with Famitsu, Sonic Forces had 4 years to be developed. From what I can understand, and please do forgive me, I'm not the best translator. In 2013, they decided to start development on the Hedgehog Engine 2, which powers Sonic Forces. The conceptual phase was from 2014 to 2016, which, let me be clear, that does not mean that no progress on the game was being made at these times, but it's not exactly a good sign when, well, 2016 up to the release seems to be when the main portion of development was taking place. Which, yeah, when you're taking a year to develop and polish your game, that's not exactly a good sign. The leaked script as well is better in some ways and worse in others. There's still giant gaping plot holes, but a lot of other things are further fleshed out than they are in the finished product. I think my favorite is former Sonic Twitter guy Aaron Weber's comments, though. I believe my favorite little bit of commentary on the early script is, "We're going in hard and fast" will be the most played line on YouTube out of context. But with all of that out of the way, the game is obviously bad. Let's start on the positive points. I unironically think that Liam O'Brien is probably the best person they could have gotten to voice Infinite in the English version. His performance is so over the top that I just want to fluff the edgy little guy and call him a little Skrunklo because Infinite is so edgy he's adorable. The Hedgehog engine as well looks good. Sure, aesthetically it's still nostalgia bait for a lot of it, but I'm at least giving you the courtesy of seeing probably the best looking area of the game. The downside is everything else. Given that the Wisp power-ups from colors are once again back and this time tied to the avatar. Not only that, but going from either of the first two weapons to anything else is a downgrade for what? A little bit of variety? Which means the multiple paths becomes a trade-off. Classic Sonic is back for some inexplicable reason that makes no sense in universe. And he's even stiffer than in Generations, and they took away the one-button spin dash and gave him Mania's drop dash instead. Plus, the music. The music is some auditory punishment. Which is the reason why I'm not using Sonic Force's music. It's just bad. There might be a good track or two hidden beneath the schlock, but even the worst Sonic games didn't make me want to gouge my ears out. But after how completely polarizing Sonic Forces was, they wanted to give things another shot, rather with telling a more serious story. Well, as I stated at the beginning, that attempt is now out, Sonic Frontiers, so did they learn? So Sonic Frontiers, while not perfect, gives me hope for the series. Let's get the negatives out of the way. While I find the idea of completely open parkour playgrounds pretty great and a good way to take the series, the environmental design is sorely lacking, to the point where I can find no fault with people saying that the game is made less by it. In addition, the music for these open zones isn't that great. And given that you're stuck with the open zones for most of the game, everything else better be worth it. And you know what? It is. To oversimplify the gameplay, Sonic Frontiers gives you the mix between the high-speed stuff with an open-world parkour playground, as well as a collectathon, weirdly enough. Your goal on each island is to free your friends, gather the Chaos Emeralds, and then fight the boss titan. Memory tokens progress the story. And honestly, on that note, the story, while the new writer does need a little bit more time to translate his writing to game, since, well, they brought Ian Flynn on board. And as a result, the story's good, but you can tell he's more used to writing for the IDW comics than for a video game. But also, you have to fight mini-bosses, which utilize some pretty fast and snappy combat for what it is that actually suits Sonic. Those give you portal gears, which are a collectible needed in order to access cyberspace stages. Cyberspace, on the other hand, is how you get vault keys, which do exactly what they say on the tin. They open the containers that contain Chaos Emeralds, which again, you kind of need to do on every single island. Some of the other emeralds will be obtained as you progress the story and clear a few mini-games. The downside with Cyberspace is it is reusing assets, which some could say is once again nostalgia baiting since Green Hill, Chemical Plant, and Sky Sanctuary are used, but I'm a little more fine with it just on the grounds of how absurd the background elements are for all of it. Like, yeah, you're still getting Green Hill, Chemical Plant, and Sky Sanctuary, but you're kind of getting the most bonkers versions in the background, really putting the, hey, we can now render into extremely far distances to good use. The payoff, though, is once you have the Chaos Emeralds, the boss titans are the primo spectacle of the game. I'm going to use the first two, Giganto and Wyvern, as I do not wish to spoil too much of the game. This is a pretty recent release, so I would encourage you all to play it. Because even with some signs of a couple cut corners here and there, Sonic Frontiers is undoubtedly quality. But Giganto, the log you've been seeing on screen for a bit, gives you the combat and teaches you that Supersonic makes you invulnerable, but that your rings are the time limit for how long you have. So upgrading your ring capacity absolutely helps with these sorts of fights because it lets you stay in the game longer, so to speak. Plus, the spectacle is, fighting this giant sinister looking thing as a glowy 3-foot tall hedgehog, and it's kinda great. The other one I would like to mention is again, Wyvern, which harkens back to the true final boss of Sonic 3 and Knuckles. It's a high-speed, high-octane chase through the entire island where you have to strike whenever you have an opening. The game does expect you to have a pretty decent grasp on the mechanics at that point, but it's such a spectacle that it's an absolute blast. Plus, for that loud, fast, and aggressive music to just heighten the mood, you actually do have metalcore this time. Probably extremely copyright bot unfriendly, so I can't use it, but it was produced in collaboration with Kaylin Quinn of Sleeping with Sirens. It is so good that it pretty much makes up for the entirety of the musical failings that Frontiers does have. It is also what led me to obtaining the soundtrack. It is that good, I had to get it. But Sonic Frontiers has been pretty praised, and rightfully so. There are some people who have been trashing the game, but come on, It is probably the most polished game in the Sonic series that we've had in quite a while. And you know what? Sega's looking at supporting the game even after launch. Sure, only one of the updates seems to be what one would call major, but hey, they're doing something right at the least. But, as this is presently the last Sonic game to be released, that brings us to... So, while I've got the calming fishing music from Frontiers playing, let me introduce someone new. This is Takashi Iizuka, the longtime head of Sonic Team. But throughout my research of just the corporate mismanagement from Sega, Sonic fans endlessly shitting on this man. And the sheer amount of times he's probably tried to direct the best game he could think of, but it just didn't turn out well. I respect this man for never giving up and always keeping a nice and positive face on. You see, the Sonic series may have had some extremely abysmal games, but it's fine. It is an absolutely fine series. But not great because of the fact that I don't think it's ever reached its full potential. When Sonic has been at its best, it's been a matter of consistency. Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Sonic Mania would represent just building upon all the 2D foundations set by 1, CD, and 2. Even if that's more Sonic 2 than anything. And on the other hand, before Heroes messed with the controls too much, Sonic Adventure 2's speed stages built off of everything Sonic stages in Sonic Adventure 1 did. And most of them were incredibly fun and controlled great. And Sonic Generations, despite its faults, took the better parts of Colors and Unleashed and made a pretty fun little Twitch Reflex game out of it. And again, it's still one that I play to this very day, especially on my Steam Deck. But that does bring us back to Sonic Frontiers, because they've explicitly stated that they want to use this as the template, the blueprint for games going forward. Which is exactly what should be done. Polish and learn from one's mistakes in order to make the best thing you possibly can. And I am absolutely fine with that because hey, if all works out, maybe Sonic can be cool again. The answer to the title card is yes and no. I don't want to go back to the mainline series right now, especially since I'm a small fry YouTuber and there's a lot of big YouTubers that are Sonic tubers. Plus, I've grown a little bit of a sour distaste after trying to cram all these games into one singular video. Ooh, this video took me a good long while. But there's a lot of side games and spin-offs that could absolutely use more attention. You already saw Tails Adventure earlier in the video, but all of the 8-bit Sonic games aside from a few are at the least interesting. And some of them are absolutely good and need more attention. And let's not forget about fan efforts, because for like every single terrible, bad, shitty Sonic fan work or ROM hack, there's a lot of really solid games out there produced by fans. And if my Sonic and the Fallen Star video was any indication, yeah, I'm willing to do videos on them. There was another fantastic one from this year as well in Sonic Triple Trouble 16-bit. In my defense, though, I did have a lot of fun making this video, and I do thank the dweeb I'm engaged to for getting me to do this, even if I know I'm now doomed to substitute the voice for Goose Honks. But this isn't even the Sega series that I was intending to take a look at, because there's one that's eluded me, because I could never figure out how to exactly execute it. Tons of discarded scripts and everything, and I honestly, genuinely want to get into it for 2023, but what could it possibly be? I'll leave it to your imaginations.